Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me on this Friday morning for this Principles of Management System Risk webinar with me, Martin Graham. I'm NQA Training Manager, responsible for the training oversight and management within NQA. So you may recognise the name or that of my colleague, Sean McDonough. So this morning, for the next hour or so, we're going to be talking about Principles of Management System Risk. I'm sure most of you have heard of this and have the concept of risk within your management system. We're just going to try and go through that a bit more plain English and try and decipher some of that for you. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping. First of all, hopefully you can all hear me. On your screen, you should see like a dialog box with a questions section. If there are any problems at any point, please just drop me a line on there and we'll see what we can do, get the technical team involved. Feel free to think of questions as you're going along. There's quite a number of people on this webinar, in excess of hundreds, so I'm not going to be answering questions as we're going along. We'll collate them at the end, and if there's any, I'll answer individually, gladly. But if there are any clustered or subject matter emails, then we'll send out a separate email in that regard. But you will all get copies of this presentation after the webinar ends, and have an audio copy available as well. So feel free to make notes, and if there's any questions, I'll hang around for 20 minutes or so, as long as it takes at the end, to run through those questions with you. So starting at the beginning then, what is risk? Fundamentally, within ISO 9001, it's defined as the effect of uncertainty. So within the context of ISO management systems, this basically relates to the risks associated with achieving the intended results, enhancing desirable effects, preventing undesirable effects, and achieving improvements. Essentially, what you're looking for here are the kind of the holes that you can fall down within your management system when it comes to achieving each of these. If you're not comfortable with the term of risk, think of preventative action. Most of you, I'm sure, would have had management systems for a good period of time now. And in the previous versions of the standard, it introduced this idea of preventative action. So essentially, it's still there, except instead of being at the back of the standard where nobody ever looked, it now sits at the front of the standard. And the idea of risk-based thinking should be kind of implicit in everything that you do as part of your management system. But think of risk as kind of identifying actions to prevent something from occurring in the first place. When you think of risks and where they may be within your management system or your organization, these typically, but not absolutely, can center around people, the process, the product, or your infrastructure. There's usually risks associated with 4 of these key things. Obviously, there's other variables such as the environment and so on, but obviously these are the kind of the key things that you'll be thinking about when it comes to quality management, or indeed management system risk in general, when it comes to health and safety or environmental. Once you've identified and you address the uncertainty, by definition, you're addressing the risk within your management system. As just mentioned there, obviously risk can apply to any management system. The thing to remember here is, particularly when it comes to those of you who are running 45001 or health and safety management systems or environmental, don't confuse occupational health and safety risks or aspects and impacts with management system risks. They're 2 separate things. They're distinct clauses within the standards. So it's worth spending a bit of time just reading the differences between a health and safety risk, for example, associated with a hazard, and a management system risk of not achieving your intended results. Obviously, there's things that they're not mutually exclusive. The things can impact each other, but you do need to consider that they are actually different. They're the same term, but they have different applications within ISO and risk-based thinking. Putting it very simply then, in plain English, what is in doubt that could affect what we do, considering all of the things that we've spoken about just then? We'll talk about it in a bit more detail as we go along, but that's kind of setting the scene for you. So what are the types of risks then? I mentioned a few just in the previous slide there. So obviously, looking at some of the high-level ones, you're looking at financial risk, that everyone's exposed to that to some degree. Compliance risk, in particular, that can be with regards to products or services, or health and safety or environmental. There's risks or uncertainties there. Human risks, obviously we're all human, and none of us are perfect, unfortunately, and obviously we have good days, bad days, and although there's this factor for kind of human error within management systems, and the idea is that you kind of factor and engineer that out as much as you possibly can. There's environmental, health and safety risks. Obviously, as we mentioned there, that's different to actually the hazards associated risks themselves. It's more to do with achieving the intended outcomes of the management system. So, for example, health and safety management system risk could be, for example, kind of your subcontractors or someone not understanding the requirements associated with your management system, making an assumption that they do and that they're working under their own steam, whereas in fact you've got a responsibility in that regard. There's obviously perception. Nowadays, everyone's customer perception and integrity and so on. This can all be associated with risk and uncertainty within your service and management system. Operational, obviously, operational risk is a big one. That can be anything through from procurement through to your resources, at any stage within the process. Look at kind of the process steps that you can that can possibly you can come undone on, and look at the operational risks associated with that. Infrastructure risks, you've got things like maintenance and so on, maintenance plans not being adhered to, infrastructure failing, technology failing, not keeping up with current technology or infrastructure that's needed to provide you with your customers with the service that they require and need. So a number of things there. So when you're looking at your system and establishing the risks and opportunities associated with it, consider some of these things. They're not absolute, but kind of try and start to use these as kind of base points, and that should lead out to some more ideas for you and your organization. So the effect of uncertainty on uncertainty that affects, kind of similar, and obviously risk within ISO is defined as the former, so the effect of an uncertainty. But obviously an uncertainty that affects something can help to determine the risk. So if you're uncertain about something, be it the person, the process, the product, or any part of what you do as an organization, your supply chain, that can lead to help you identify risk within your management system. Whichever way you choose it and whatever approach you intend to choose, is risk is involved and the output is the same. That is to say, you need to assess the risk and determine any action that may or may not be necessary to address that risk in order to address the requirements of the management system and achieve your intended results. Action taken to address a risk typically addresses an uncertainty. So if you're addressing a risk, by definition, you're going to reverse engineer in that, and you're going to be addressing a risk within that process. Contextual risks, we'll come on to context in just a short while, but essentially something that is within context is relevant to you as an organization. So a contextual risk arguably is a relevant uncertainty. So that's something that's an uncertainty within your management system that's relevant to you. I think that's kind of something to bear in mind. There are generic things. I mean, I've been on no ends of audits when you come along and you see things like political and Brexit and so on, that kind of thing, which are, they are relevant and they're certainly valid to some degree, but it's they may not be necessarily anything that you can do something about, and it keep things relevant when you're generating and thinking about the risk-based approach within your management system. So risk-based thinking, as I already mentioned, there it's at the beginning of the standard for a reason. The idea is that there shouldn't be an afterthought. Risk-based thinking should be embedded within you and your organization and the approach that you're taking, and everyone within that, really, everyone that's involved in the service delivery or operation of what you do as an organization. It's not a separate component, so it may sit as a separate part of the management system, as a record or something like that, but the idea of concepts of risks and understanding of that needs to be inherent and embedded within the whole of your organization. As I already mentioned, their risk can exist in any part of the system, the process of how you operate, or any functions that you operate as part of your business, and should be considered at each stage. So thinking of a process, you think of a beginning, a middle, and an end. There'll be uncertainties associated with that. So if you're looking at a production environment, for example, manufacturing, you can have risks associated with your supply chain from the very beginning through to the production planning. If there's any infrastructure maintenance right through to the delivery and even final use or warranty is associated with the product or service, you need to make sure that you consider risks at any stage of that process. Obviously, not all processes will carry or be exposed to the same level of risks. It's some organisations may only buy in, very small consumable items that don't really impact their product or service. But obviously, procurement within another organisation can be very high level and can have a significant risk associated with it, or uncertainties that you need to manage those and prevent things from upsetting the apple cart, so to speak. Identifying and addressing your risk, it should be a proactive rather than reactive process. Going back to the preventative action model, I'm sure some of you, or all of you, and I certainly see it in my auditing career, is that people think of preventative action to prevent reoccurrence. That's not what it's about at all. The idea of preventative action, and indeed this idea of identifying risks and opportunities and actions, is that you're proactive with things and you're not reacting. You're actually kind of addressing problems before they occur, or at least mitigating the circumstances and introducing the controls that are necessary to mitigate that risk. Risk-based thinking, it is integral to everyday life and business operations. Recognise and applying this is important. I think any business that's running to any degree of success, you're going to be thinking about risks, maybe not in name, but you'll certainly be thinking about things as you're going along. You're not just going to suddenly go and start using a new supplier or employ a new employee because you like the look of them, or you've heard good things. You're going to go through a process of evaluating, vetting, introducing, and monitoring these people and supply chains. So the idea is just to recognise within the management system, what you're already doing and how that can be applied to ISO 9001. It's quite often with ISOs, the terminology gets a little bit, because it applies to so many countries and so many industries, it has to become somewhat generic. It's very specific and yet generic at the same time. So think about kind of what you're doing and make that apply to ISO 9001 or any management system that employs risk-based thinking. Just continuing the ideas and the themes. Obviously, risk is not only negative. For example, good example, competition to any business or organization is a risk, but that can lead you to, or force you to kind of consider becoming more efficient or proactive in terms of marketing, or expanding the offerings, or becoming a bit more selective in how and what business you choose. So it can start to kind of, that can ultimately lead to opportunities. So don't think of necessarily risk as a negative process. Obviously, risk-based thinking allows you to consider the current situation and the possibilities for an impact of change. So obviously, change within risk, we'll come into this in a little bit more detail shortly, is a big part of this. There's clauses within the standard that talk about the management of change and the risks associated with that. Some risks will be acceptable. The standard doesn't require that you address and eliminate or mitigate every single risk. It asks that you assess them, identify them, and take actions as necessary, as we've said, to make sure that the management system can achieve its intended results. And those intended results are around your policy statement, your objectives, compliance, customer requirements, and so on. So anything that can get in that way. But obviously, some of these will need to be acceptable. But by nature, you can't eliminate every risk that exists. You need to put your sensible hats on and look at the disadvantages, whether or not and advantages of taking action. It comes down to kind of whether or not something's practicable to assess. And remember, it's ultimately the risks of and associated with achieving the objectives of the management system. That is your conformity of products and services and achieving the intended outcomes that are to be considered. So that's the key thing here. Remember your context to keep things relevant, as we've already said, and that risk-based thinking is not new. Chances are, in fact, it's almost certain that it's something that you're already doing, and it's a continual process within the organisation. So the idea is, look at what you're already doing, recognise, that you may already be doing some of these things, and get people's, and as many people as you can, individuals' perceptions on this, because everyone has a different perception of risk and how it can affect them. Risk is all relative. We've already said that everything has to be in context. Obviously, the consequences can vary by organisation, product, and service. So again, it comes back to keeping things relevant and in context to you. Keep it simple. Don't overthink things. Sometimes it's easy to just keep thinking, and you're thinking there must be something else. But ultimately, if you feel comfortable with what you've discussed and determined as an organisation, kind of stop there. An auditor won't necessarily come in and start saying you've missed off this, missed off that. They'll have a conversation with you and want to discuss about your business and understand what you're doing and how it works. And obviously, so if there's something has been missed, that can be spoken about. But obviously, keep it simple. Don't kind of feel like you've got to over-engineer and have every risk under the sun, because it's just going to become it won't become a practical process for you. Involvement of people, this is an important thing, obviously dependent upon the size and shape of your organisation. Get as many people involved as you can. As I've already said, top management do need to be required in the process and involved in the process, and they need to promote risk-based thinking. But obviously someone who's directly involved in a process might necessarily, arguably will almost definitely be best placed to identify what uncertainties are involved. So talk to the people, talk to the operators, talk to different members of the team, get their ideas on, what they think is good, bad, and indifferent about their process. What holes are they filling just by doing their J job, and can that be, rolled out over to other departments or lessons learned? So get people involved. Obviously, as many as you can. If you've just got a one-man band, so to speak, then that's pretty straightforward. But if you've got different departments and so on, get everyone involved in the process. It shouldn't just fall to an individual. Think about what issues can affect your organisation's values, performance, perception, knowledge, and how can these affect your objectives. So that's an important thing to remember. The standard talks about achieving intended results, and that again all falls back to your policy and ultimately then your objectives. So you need to think about what issues can affect that, and ultimately look at the uncertainties and risks associated with each of those. What actions are practical to take? I've already said there, some actions, some risks you might decide ultimately are just they're acceptable. You're going to live with them and manage them rather than keep trying to eliminate them. You might want to avoid them, take a different route, obviously eliminate, substitute, manage the likelihood, and that's the other elements that are there, managing the consequence. Ultimately, you might decide to accept and manage the risk, or to some degree, as I've already said there, you might have decided to pursue it if it ultimately leads to an opportunity and makes life exciting for you as an organisation, or the opportunities that may be out there. Competition. There's a risk in terms of expanding your product range or going into a different sector. Yes, that's risky and uncertain, but ultimately it may lead to an opportunity and good things for you as an organisation. So take action. That's something to remember. Obviously, the standards say that once you've determined the risks and assessed them and so on, you need to take action to address them. Now, obviously, that's what the audit process will look for, is that you've actually, if you determine something, it can't just sit there doing nothing. You need to take action to either address that in some form or other, or at least show that you've considered it and demonstrate that to the audit team. But obviously keep the actions in context and proportionate. You don't want to over-engineer and put a lot of resource into something that's ultimately not going to be of much benefit or much concern to you. Preventive action, obviously I mentioned that a few times now, but it hasn't necessarily, in fact it hasn't gone, it's not necessarily gone, it actually hasn't gone. If you prefer it, use that term. Some people like to use this idea, look, we're going to go about a preventative process or proactive prevention, use that term. Sometimes risk, and it automatically defaults to health and safety. When people talk about risk, I think people hear risk and they automatically default to health and safety. But if you don't like the term risk, obviously just substitute or kind of use a definition there of a preventative action, so that people can maybe get that term a bit more familiar with them. So risk-based thinking is critical. Ultimately, it enables an organisation to determine the factors that could cause its process and its quality management system to deviate from the planned results, to put in place preventative controls to minimise negative effects, and to make maximum use of opportunities. So that's the underlying principles of risk-based thinking there. There's no correct methodology. There's a number of things. There's a couple of ideas we'll come on later. I'm sure you've all heard about things like SWOT analysis and PESTLES and so on, FMEAs, different industry terms. But ultimately, there's not a correct or absolute methodology. You can use numbers, colours, nothing at all, whatever you feel is necessary for you. Obviously, this is different slightly to traditional kind of health and safety, hazard risk assessment, identification risk assessment. We're talking here about kind of management system risk, but obviously the methodology could be simply kind of having conversations and recording those conversations and getting the team involved in identifying actions associated with as a result of those conversations that you have. Whilst you may not be able to eliminate any uncertainties, you can manage the effects, which is really what this is all about. The uncertainties will always exist, but the standard essentially ask that you identify them, look at the risk associated with that, and then manage the effects in the course of determining the actions to address them. So just going on to the last few slides here with regards to risk-based thinking, look at the failure points within the process. We've already said, look at each of the stages of the process of what you do in terms of your scope of supply. Look at the failure points. What are the holes you can go down? Is it people not understanding? Is it a process being inefficient? Is it a supply chain issue? Is it communication issue? Whatever it may be. Is it political, financial? Is there lack of knowledge, training, awareness? Whatever it may be. All of these things can factor into you, kind of leading to failures within the system. Obviously, risk perception, as I mentioned there, more people who get involved, you'll get a broader kind of understanding of their perception of the risk and what it can affect you as an organisation. Obviously, take one step at a time. Kind of just don't feel like you've got to do everything in one go. The standard doesn't require it requires that you do these things, but there's no time frame on them, and it requires kind of continual improvement. So this isn't an absolute thing. So take your time. Identify the risks and manage the ones that you can and you feel necessary, and then obviously identify the risk ratings as and when you go along. Obviously, joined up thinking, it's a bit of a cliche term, but obviously, keep things in context, like we've already said, so don't step outside of what you know. Don't just sit there and brainstorm every risk under the sun. Keep things relevant and manageable for you and as an organisation, because that's where the value is. Obviously, document if necessary. The standards vary somewhat, ever so slightly. Give an example, 9001 doesn't require that you necessarily document your risks and opportunities, whereas 14001 requires that you document the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. So slight difference there. And then moving on to 45001, that requires that you document your risks and opportunities. Absolutely. So a little bit of a disconnect there and a bit of an inconsistency. So obviously you need to consider that as you're going through your management system. Obviously for those of you that are operating integrated management systems, the risks could be common across all three standards. So you might find that you documented it for one thing and that ultimately that covers another. But there may be some quality related risks that you simply don't need to document down. So have a read through the standard, read the clause and understand kind of what it's actually asking you to do. And obviously documentation can help because that gives a bit of a focus. It gives a focal point as part of your management review meeting where the actions that you take need to be addressed for their effectiveness. So it can provide useful to document these as relevant to you as an organisation. Addressing the risks may identify some opportunities. So risk around suppliers, like we've already said, it may source a better alternative. So it's not necessarily all a bad thing. Final point, obviously there's uncertainty in everything that we do, everything that an organisation does from top to the bottom, and identifying this and evaluating the effect and determining the action is the fundamental concept of risk-based thinking. So keep it simple, kind of look at what's uncertain, where things may go wrong, and then identify some actions to address those. Just looking at some of the possible effects of uncertainty. Obviously customer requirements, so ultimately these are possible risks. So this isn't an absolute list, but it gives you a kind of an idea of some of the areas that can be considered. So customer requirements not being met is a fundamental one. Insufficient product knowledge, that could be of you as an organisation, not understanding necessarily compliance needs or product requirements. It's it may not happen, but it's if you don't understand something at the beginning, you won't necessarily understand how to deliver it. So wrong product being delivered or late delivery, typical risk. Incorrect materials used through lack of identification or location or whatever it may be, or procurement process. Contamination or damage to a product. Resources themselves. So again, we've already mentioned there, is there uncertainty associated with an individual or group's competence? Is the training process effective? Are people aware? Are the resources available? Kind of if you've got big orders coming in and the resources, obviously that doesn't necessarily, it's not just people here. We're talking about the processes and the infrastructure that sits behind that, being machinery, equipment, and so on. Is there uncertainty there that you need to be aware of and address? And obviously knowledge within an organisation. Accidents, there's uncertainties, risks associated with accidents. Resource succession failure comes up quite a lot during conversations now. Kind of if you've got maybe an aging workforce or maybe, I don't know, an unstable workforce or lack of resources coming in, Is there a succession issue there? You know, the people, the organisation is not going to be able to support things moving forward. Or its planning or its management system even. There's a knowledge issue there. Supply chain issues, common one again. Obviously, uncertainty is associated with those in a number of ways. Financial instability and overspend. Obviously, you know, things can look good on paper, but the reality is they may not be entirely practical for you as an organisation. Communication, language barriers, obviously, arguably could be an issue with regards to health and safety. So there's a risk there that people, you know, the message isn't being understood or communicated correctly. Compliance breach, obviously a big issue there. Process inefficiency. If there's inefficiency in the process, it can lead to uncertainties in terms of, you know, achieving intended outcomes, i.e., keeping the customer happy and providing the service that you want to. Infrastructure issues. If there's issues over your maintenance cycle or, you know, even the suitability for particular infrastructure, again, looking at it from a, you know, health and safety perspective or environmental, if there's insufficient resource of infrastructure there to support, you know, your compliance process or your management system, that ultimately leaves you exposed to a risk. Uncontrolled change within a management system, or, you know, change is inevitable. Death, taxes, and change are the only few things we can rely on. So obviously it happens, but the standards require that you manage the change process and manage the changes that happen. And obviously, when there is change, that can result in uncertainties and risks. So that could be again against your resources, or, you know, anything that happens within an organisation. Uncertainty, okay, obviously it can affect your reputation as well. You know, obviously it's nowadays with, you know, the amount of social media and communication, the way it spreads, you know, reputation can be damaged pretty rapidly if you're not careful. So look at the uncertainties associated with that, you know, so don't fall down a hole. So what are the benefits? After we've done all that, there must be some benefits. I'm sure there are. So basically, some key benefits here, not absolutely, but gives you an idea of the kind of things. Improve the likelihood of achieving your objectives, achieve consistency of output, have confidence in the system and its deliverables. It can help to establish a proactive culture of improvement within your organisation. So getting people involved, it you know, kind of, it makes people aware of where they sit in the whole thing. It can obviously naturally assist, and does assist indeed, with your audit, statutory and regulatory compliance process. Can assist with operational efficiency and governance. As we mentioned previously there, the effectiveness of change management. So if you're looking at all the uncertainties, you're not just doing things like knee-jerk, you've actually got a controlled process in place. So incredibly, there's actually more, potentially more. You could arguably enhance your knowledge base by spreading and enhancing the knowledge that exists within an organisation. Stakeholder perception, we've already mentioned perception there. It's a big thing within organisations nowadays, how they're perceived locally and nationally within their industry. You can increase the resilience associated with your system and your operations. Obviously, if you're taking risks and uncertainties out of the process or mitigating them, ultimately that leads to a bit more resilience within the system. Arguably, it leads to a better management system effectiveness, which really is kind of a big keyword within ISOs. Preventing negative effects, and ultimately achieving some reliability of products and services. So the idea is that these are some of the benefits that can be associated with looking at risk-based thinking. So where does risk sit within the standard? Just going to run through kind of some of the key principles, clauses 4 through 10, give you a little bit of a background on each, kind of how that sits within the risk-based thinking principle side of things. Obviously, clause 4, basically, this is where determination of the management system process is exposed to the risk sits. So basically what that's saying there is that you've got to understand and determine all the processes that sit within your management system, and have a management system that exists and functions. Clause 5, top management must engage. This includes the promotion and application of risk-based thinking. So it can't, ultimately, responsibility can be delegated, but accountability sits with top management there, and those are the people that are responsible for the direction and strategic direction and management of the organisation. Clause 6, this is where the actual risks and opportunities clause sits. So obviously that demands that you identify risks and indeed opportunities and then take action. So clause 7, requires that the organisation that you determine and provide resources to support the management system and ultimately, address the risks associated with it. Obviously, then you go into clause 8, which is the operational side of things. And that really links in because obviously you've got to manage the operational processes in line with clause 6. It's got to be this joined up thinking approach. The clauses are separate, but ultimately the ideas and principles should flow through. Clause 9 in the performance management side of things, obviously we mentioned there about effectiveness. So once you've come to the end of it, once you've planned and done and checked and acted, which we'll come on to in a short while, how effective are the actions? So so they don't just sit there in isolation, just take an action and then forget about it. You've got to go back and do we need to retake the action? Do we need to rethink the action? Was it no good at all, or whatever it may be? So look at the effectiveness. Obviously, and then clause 10 it sits in there the requirement for improvement, which is their continuing improvement sits, and obviously it requires that you address the non-conformities, accidents, incidents, and it helps to address any undesired effects. So basically, those of you, the reason that's 4 through 10 there, those of you familiar with management system, which I'm sure that you are, they're the kind of the clauses that sit within the Annex SL structure of the ISO standards that they've all taken now. So this kind of risk-based thinking sits within the whole kind of 4 through 10 structure of Annex SL. And although the word risk doesn't necessarily exist in each of those clauses, it is kind of the principles of it exist within each of those. So it's worth spending a bit of time understanding what the standard's asking there. Obviously, you've got the plan, do, check, act cycle, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with and have heard time and time again. But obviously, within the concept of risk-based thinking and introducing that into management systems, the idea is that obviously the planning phase, that sits within the leadership and the commitment side of things and providing the resources, and identifying and planning actions to address the risks themselves. Obviously that's you doing your job, and then implementing and communicating the mitigation plan, making things happen. Obviously checking, that's the back end side of it, monitoring the implementation phase, making sure you're doing what you say you want to do and achieving where you want to be, and then acting on things. Once it's once you've done all the checking, you need to know whether or not it's you need to act any further, or whether you can park things and move on to the next stage of the process. So the idea of a management program then within risk-based thinking, quite straightforward, five quite easy steps that most of you will be familiar with, I'm sure. But identify the risk, the uncertainty, analyze it, grade it, see how important it is to you as an organization, treat it as may be necessary with the actions that you feel are relevant, monitor this, monitor how effective the actions have been, and indeed if the risks are changing, if there's a change in circumstances, be it the process, the person, or whatever it may be, that can lead you back into the reassessing the risks associated with what you've determined, and ultimately implement controls. So you can see kind of those quite straightforward steps to a management program there when it comes to risk-based thinking. So possible methodologies there. Again, this isn't an absolute list, but to give you kind of a bit of an idea of some of the areas that we can think of. Obviously, SWOTs, you may have heard of those. Kind of look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Again, you can use these ideas to kind of apply to risk-based thinking, determining risks. PESTLs, obviously, looking at the political, environmental, social, technological, legal, and environmental, I believe that is, economic, sorry, PESTL elements of your business and what you do, and how they can affect and create uncertainties. FMEA, failure mode effect analysis. Obviously, there's dedicated standards, ISO 31000, that can might be worth looking at, because you don't necessarily have to be compliant to them. You can start adopting the principles of them. Obviously, cause and effect, brainstorming, get people involved, get people's thoughts on it. Interview, have conversations and chats and so on. Obviously, root cause analysis, it can help you identify the root cause of a problem, but also kind of any uncertainties associated with it. So risk and leadership, obviously very important. One, the standards will require it, but so it's obviously worth being aware of kind of what this may involve. So you can't necessarily control the people through policies, procedures, and policing. You can only do it through a strong risk management culture and absolute integrity in all the leaders. So leaders, those of you amongst you who are leaders in one form or another, you need to kind of be able to demonstrate that you're applying these principles and get people involved in the process. ask the right questions, kind of, don't just make an assumption, kind of just challenge and engage people. As already mentioned there, consult with a mix of people, get different perspectives, different people's different background and knowledge of your organisation and where they sit within it. It can help you to. It does open. I've seen it open lots of eyes during audits. They might have actually gone out on the shop floor, so to speak, and engaging with people. You always get a mix of people. Some people always want to put their hand up and volunteer information, but the idea is that if you make those forums available, you might get some good feedback from the people that you work with. Obviously, encourage critical testing of ideas and assumptions. Obviously, don't encourage people to be critical, but obviously more critical in terms of testing the, the way that an organisation works and how it can be better. So in summary, obviously policies and procedures for predicting, evaluating and managing risk are important. But obviously, if you don't ask the right questions and engage, seek out diversity and involve people, you're not going to necessarily get the value and understand the risks associated with you or your organisation. So you really need to keep those principles at the front of your mind. So change and risk, we mentioned this earlier on. Obviously, everything changes at some point or another. So with regard to risk, obviously, you need to keep the management system under review. Obviously, things can change, and indeed they definitely will. But obviously, your management system needs to be able to kind of identify that change, or at the very least react to it and have the right people and process to react to the impact that can have, because obviously with change there comes uncertainties. So have a look at the plan of changes clause within the standard, and it sets the scene with regards to what's expected of you there in that regard. Give an example, obviously something as simple as changing an organizational structure could have huge impacts on the management system, and the risks should be identified and considered. So taking someone out of a role, or removing a position, or substituting and combine them into two roles into one, for example, kind of how does that affect, the management system and the process and what it does, so what were all of the roles each person was performing, not just the documented tasks, but the undocumented also. So can one person do all of the tasks? Is there a risk of some of the tasks not being performed? So there's lots of things to be considered. So just changing a person, or removing a position, or changing a responsibility, it can have impacts. Don't look at things in isolation. Use this as an example, but it's I think that's the thing. When you look at the process, don't look at things in isolation. Look at the wider impact. One part of the equation is exactly that. It's part of a process. So look at how that change, if you like, can affect the beginning, or the before, I should say, and the after of that step. Look at what's going on there. So supply chain risk management, it is a big thing with regards to any management system or any organisation. Many varied risks around with suppliers. Obviously, you've got some specific things: counterfeit parts, parts obsolescence, product safety, part qualifications. This goes on and on. Essentially, even the supplier being in existence and being able to supply it on time, in conformance with what you need as an organisation. So think about that process. Supply chain risk management is a big thing with an organisation, because ultimately your part could, and almost certainly you're part of a supply chain as well. So you're looking at what's coming into you and the uncertainties associated with that, but ultimately you've got to manage your part of the supply chain. So you've got to look at the risks associated with your step of the process, so that you can know you're not affecting the next person in the chain, so to speak. So the standard's not asking you to perform risk assessment on each supplier, but look from a category type perspective and what problems can arise. So whether it's a product or a service, a good example would be kind of construction. It's a fairly kind of, obviously, a highly risk-based industry. But if you've got a supplier or subcontractor coming in to undertake a role or function of your organisation on your behalf, then you need to be aware that that they're aware of your policies, procedures, and they're going to be working in accordance with. Because if you don't, ultimately that's leaving you exposed to uncertainties within the supply chain, and indeed the perception and your management system. If they're not compliant to you, then ultimately you're not compliant. So it's one to consider. So some examples: obviously suppliers going out of business. It happens. Have we looked at any alternatives that could be used? People not understanding the roles and responsibilities, kind of within your management system. How robust is your induction process or your training? If there's changes, or changes to the process or the product or equipment, look at kind of the people, make sure people understand where they fit in the whole thing. And indeed, are they even aware, of what risk-based thinking is? You don't expect people to understand, the inner workings of ISO 9001 or ISO 45001, but they should be familiar with kind of, okay, what it actually means to them and how they can affect and help your organisation achieve what it's trying to. Obviously, there's uncertainties around inadequate infrastructure. So obviously you consider your maintenance program, any instructions associated with use of infrastructure and equipment, and obviously efficiencies as well. If you've got an inefficient machine, that can lead to things, issues with regards to environmental management. If you've got a massively inefficient machine or production inefficiency, it can lead to uncertainties in that regard, or risks that you're not going to achieve what you're trying to achieve in terms of your objectives. Poor communication, it's a fundamental point, but it can, if people don't understand or aren't aware, if there's a lack of it or is it ineffective, it can lead to uncertainties and you're not going to be where you want to be as an organisation. Documentation, is it available? Is it up to date? Is it fit for use? Do people understand? If there's we mentioned language barriers earlier, if people aren't necessarily, it's all very well showing someone something, but how they actually read and understood it, if they don't, then that's an uncertainty, a risk associated with health and safety, as an example, or any part of it, environmental indeed. If people aren't aware of what they need to be doing, it can lead to problems within your system. So external influences, how can they impact you and how can that be managed? Obviously, we've spoken about suppliers, but you've got anything from the standard talks about interested parties and how they can influence you as an organisation. So if you've got even some even neighbours or other members of the public, they may have they can impact you as an organisation, and you need to assess that and assess the uncertainty and risk that could have on you and how you need to react to their needs and expectations. So be aware of all these things. There are obviously just some examples that it's not an absolute list. It gives you a bit of an idea of kind of some of the areas of of risk and uncertainty that can be applied to any management system really, or indeed any organisation. There's certain things there that could be applied from beginning to end, top to bottom. So I say it's not an absolute list. It gives you a bit of a flavour of some of the things that an auditor may want to kind of see that you've considered, or but obviously, as I said at the very beginning, everything has to be relevant to you as an organisation. Don't just come up with a supply chain issue if it's not necessarily relevant or in context to you as an organisation, because yes, it may be technically correct, but it's going to be of very little value to you and the audit process. So have a think about all of that. So keeping it very simply indeed. So basically, when it comes to risk-based thinking and the principles of risk, you need to determine what is uncertain around what you're trying to achieve, what it can affect and how you can manage it. So it really is as simple as that. Look at what the management system is trying to achieve, look at what the objectives are stating, look at what your policy statement's trying to is kind of building you around and providing that framework. Look at what your people want, look at what your customers want, look at everything that's needed and expected of you as an organisation. Look at the look at the holes you can fall down. Look at the failure points in delivering those points, those outputs, the standard calls them. So, and that essentially is going to lead you to risks, and those risks are what you need to address as part of your ISO. Certainly 9001 and 14 and 45, but even in 27001 and AS and any standards that you care to think of, this idea of risk-based thinking, it exists there. So keep that simple phrase in mind. Don't overthink it. Don't over-engineer your system. Keep it relevant. Keep it simple, and you should get some benefit from it. Well, hopefully get some benefit from it. Obviously, that's kind of the end of that now. You talk about risk kind of all day long, and there's an awful lot of kind of discussions to be had, and I have no end of conversations during audits in different organisations that I go to. But have a think about it. Obviously, review these slides, look at the points that it's made. We have actually introduced some. It's a 2-day course on the introduction of the introductions to risk management. We can offer this as an in-house course, but it might be something that you want to consider should you want to take this any further. Obviously, just check out the website there. That'll give you a bit more information. As I said at the beginning, I'm more than happy to hang around for as long as it takes to answer questions online here, but failing that, you will get a copy of this sent out to you. I believe there'll be a copy of the webinar available, a recording as well, that you can download and listen to should you so desire. Otherwise, you've got the points there, the the email and telephone number to contact. And